94 earthquakes struck one volcano west of Naples, Italy yesterday, and one of them was the strongest ever measured there in the modern era. A magnitude 4.7, 3 kilometers under the town of Pozzuoli, cracked walls, dropped a building facade onto parked cars, and sent thousands of people into the streets for the night. 2.4 million people live within 20 kilometers of the epicenter. By the end of this report, you'll understand why records at this volcano are supposed to be physically impossible to break, and why they keep breaking anyway. At 7:46 yesterday evening, the ground on the western edge of Naples, Italy, snapped harder than it has at any point in the modern instrumental era. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake ruptured inside the Campi Flegrei caldera at a depth of just 3 kilometers, under 2 miles, with its epicenter in the sector near the Solfatara crater, barely 5 kilometers from the center of Pozzuoli and 9 kilometers from downtown Naples. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the INGV, located the event within minutes. Then something happened that longtime watchers of this volcano say they had essentially never seen. The magnitude was revised upward from a smaller preliminary value to a final 4.7, confirmed by the Vesuvius Observatory Operations Room about half an hour after the shaking stopped. That number is the whole story, and here is why. Campi Flegrei's previous instrumental records were 2 magnitude 4.6 events in 2025. Before that, the benchmark was the 1982 to 1984 crisis, which peaked around magnitude 4. Yesterday evening's earthquake beat all of them. By the framing Italian scientists themselves are using, this was the strongest earthquake felt in the Campania region in roughly 40 years of continuous monitoring. And in the longer view, the strongest seismic event at this caldera since its last actual eruption, Monte Nuovo in 1538. A volcano that has not erupted in nearly 5 centuries just produced the hardest jolt anyone has ever measured there. The location makes it worse. This was not out at sea, and it was not under some empty ridge. The rupture sat directly beneath the most closely watched square kilometers of volcanic ground in Europe, the same sector around Solfatara and Pisciarelli that volcanologists have repeatedly identified as the most likely site of any future eruption. The system did not choose a quiet corner to break its record, it broke it dead center. The town built on top of it felt every bit of the shaking. The shaking emptied buildings across Pozzuoli, Boccoli, and the western districts of Naples within seconds. It was a hot summer Friday evening. People were home, and thousands of them ended up in the streets, many staying out through the night rather than sleeping under masonry they no longer trust. 4 people were injured, all treated and released. Fire crews spent the evening on calls for falling plaster, cracked walls, and in Pozzuoli, a section of building facade that broke loose and dropped onto parked cars below. Video from the area shows boulders and rubble crushing vehicles, and footage of a hillside collapsing. Churches and the older residential blocks took the worst of the visible damage, which is exactly the pattern engineers feared. This part of Italy is stacked with tough block and masonry construction, some of it centuries old and much of it already fatigued by 3 years of repeated shaking. The infrastructure impact spread wider than the damage. Power went out across several neighborhoods on the western side of Naples, Boccoli, Fuori Grotta, Saccovo, and Pianura, and on the island of Procida offshore. The Cumana and Circumflegrea commuter rail lines, which run through and around the volcanic zone, were suspended so engineers could inspect the tracks, and local metro service stopped with them. Italy's Civil Protection Department opened a crisis desk within hours, and the Civil Protection Minister personally confirmed the injury count while inspection teams began working through homes and churches. One more detail stood out to seismologists. The earthquake was felt across the entire city of Naples and well beyond it, reportedly as far as the province of Caserta, more than 30 kilometers from the epicenter. Residents who have lived through every event of the past 3 years described the motion as sharper and longer than the magnitude 4.6 earthquakes of last year. The instruments agree with them, and it gets worse. The record was not one isolated jolt. The magnitude 4.7 did not arrive alone. Tallies compiled from the INGV's public monitoring lists put the day's total at roughly 94 earthquakes at the caldera, one of the most seismically active single days of the entire unrest. The morning opened with small events, including a magnitude 1.7. Then, with very little escalation to warn anyone, the 4.7 ruptured at 7:46 in the evening. Within minutes came a 1.7, then a 1.4, then a 1.0, and the sequence kept going overnight. At least 10 aftershocks in the first hours, the strongest around magnitude 2.6, with more than 40 events on the INGV's aerial list by late evening. The depths of those aftershocks deserve attention. Several of them occurred at less than 1 kilometer below the surface, shallower than the record event itself. Earthquakes that shallow hit the ground above them like a hammer strike, sharp, loud, and violent for their size, even when the magnitude looks trivial on paper. For the people of Pozzuoli, every one of those small events landed as a bang and a shudder through buildings that had just been stress-tested by the strongest earthquake in the caldera's recorded history. There is a pattern in that sequence worth naming. This was not a main shock with a tidy decaying aftershock tale of the kind textbooks draw for tectonic faults. It was a swarm, a burst of activity organized around the big event, jumping between small patches of crust, exactly what an inflating volcanic system produces when the rock above it is cracking in many places at once. The distinction matters because swarm behavior is the signature of the process driving all of this. And that process has a name Italians have known for 2,000 years. The exposure numbers around this volcano have no parallel in Europe. The INGV's own municipality table for yesterday's earthquake counts roughly 2.4 million people living within 20 kilometers of the epicenter. Pozzuoli, with more than 81,000 residents, sits 5 kilometers away. The city of Naples proper, nearly 1 million people, begins 9 kilometers away. Quarto, Bacoli, Monte di Procida, Giuliano. Town after town stacks up inside the first dozen kilometers, and all of it stands on or beside an active caldera. Italian emergency planning divides the area into zones. The official red zone, the area that would have to be evacuated entirely before an eruption, holds roughly 500,000 people. The core of highest exposure in and around Pozzuoli itself holds somewhere between 80 and 100,000. These are not abstract map lines. The red zone includes working ports, hospitals, schools, and commuter rail stations, all of it woven through a caldera whose floor has physically lifted the town around it. The harbor at Pozzuoli has risen so much during this unrest that the seafloor has shallowed and ferries have had trouble docking. Civil Protection's standing plan assumes it would take about 72 hours to move the red zone's population. And that assumption itself depends on the volcano providing clear, unambiguous warning signs days in advance, an assumption some Italian scientists publicly doubt, as we will see later in this report. Set those numbers against what this caldera has done in its past. Campi Flegrei produced the Campanian ignimbrite eruption roughly 39,000 years ago, one of the largest explosive eruptions in the Mediterranean's history, and the Neapolitan yellow tuff eruption roughly 15,000 years ago. Nobody credible is forecasting anything on that scale now. But the machinery under those historic eruptions and the machinery under yesterday's earthquake is the same system. And understanding what it is actually doing right now requires one piece of science. There is no plate boundary under Naples. Nothing is grinding past anything else beneath Campi Flegrei. And that single fact changes the meaning of every earthquake there. These events are volcanic. They are made by the caldera itself. The engine is a phenomenon Italians call bradyseism, the slow breathing of the caldera floor. Since 2005, the ground around Pozzuoli has been rising almost continuously, and the total is now about 1.4 meters at the center of the uplift, more than 4.5 feet. Through July of this year, the rate has been running at roughly 10 millimeters per month, month after month. The driver is pressure, hot fluids and gas, fed from a magma body sitting roughly 7 to 8 kilometers down, accumulating in the shallow hydrothermal system and pushing the ground upward like the lid of a pot. The INGV's rapid moment tensor analysis of yesterday's event tells the same story. The faulting was extensional, the crust being pulled apart as the caldera inflates, computed at just 2 kilometers depth. That is not the mechanics of colliding plates, that is the mechanics of a stretching lid. As the ground inflates, the shallow crust stretches, and when the stretch exceeds the rock strength, it cracks. Every crack is an earthquake. That is why virtually every earthquake at Campi Flegrei, including yesterday's record, is shallower than about 3 kilometers. And it means each significant earthquake here is best understood not as a random jolt, but as a strength test, a measurement of how much load the rock over this volcano can carry before it breaks. Which raises the obvious question, what exactly is being tested? Between the surface of Pozzuoli and the hot interior of the volcano sits a layer scientists call the caprock, a brittle lid of old welded volcanic rock only about 2 to 3 kilometers thick. Below it, the rock is too hot to snap. It bends and flows instead of breaking. That thin brittle layer is the only part of the system that can make earthquakes at all, and it is also the seal that keeps the pressurized hydrothermal system, and ultimately the magmatic system beneath it, contained. The thinness of that lid has a consequence most people find surprising. It caps the maximum possible earthquake. The size of an earthquake is set by the area of the fault patch that ruptures, and you can only fit a limited fault inside a brittle layer 2 to 3 kilometers thick. Records at Campi Flegrei are supposed to be hard to break. The physics itself enforces a ceiling. And that is precisely why yesterday matters so much. The ceiling has now been raised 4 times in under 3 years, 4.2, 4.4, 4.6, and now 4.7. When a system with a built-in maximum keeps exceeding its own maximum, the system is telling you that something underneath it is changing. The published science makes that reading harder to dismiss. Research produced during this unrest, including laboratory work on the caldera's own rock led by the volcanologist Christopher Kilburn and colleagues, concludes that 4 decades of stretching and heating have progressively weakened the crust above the system, leaving it with roughly a third of the strength it had in the early 1980s. Weaker rock carrying more stress, breaking in bigger patches closer to the surface. Every part of that sentence moves in the wrong direction, and every additional record is another data point confirming the trend. So what does one more record actually mean? Scientists watching the system see 2 defensible readings of yesterday's earthquake. And the unsettling part is what they have in common. The first reading is the less alarming one. Decades of uplift have compacted and locked sections of the shallow crust, so stress now accumulates across larger patches before letting go. In this view, the caldera is getting stiffer in places, storing more elastic energy per rupture, and when it finally fails, it fails bigger. The earthquakes grow not because the danger is growing, but because the rock releases its load in larger, less frequent installments. That version fits a caldera that is aging through a long unrest without necessarily approaching an eruption. The second reading is simpler and less comfortable. The driving pressure from below is still increasing, and the system keeps finding new ceilings because the push keeps getting stronger. Same source, same mechanism, larger and larger releases. A trend line that has not bent in 20 years and shows no sign of bending. Now, the data available today cannot cleanly separate those 2 readings, and honest scientists say so. But notice what both readings share. Under either interpretation, the ground shaking gets worse before it gets better, because neither the uplift nor the seismic energy release is decelerating. And shallow earthquakes punish buildings far beyond their magnitude. A magnitude 4.7 at 3 kilometers depth delivers far more violence to the structures directly above it than a much larger earthquake 40 or 50 kilometers down ever could. Magnitude is logarithmic. Yesterday's event released roughly 1.4 times the energy of last year's 4.6, and about twice the energy of the 4.4 events before that. Italian engineers have warned that an event in the magnitude 5 range, which this trajectory cannot rule out, could start collapsing the weakest of Pozzuoli's fatigued masonry outright. The distance from 4.7 to 5.0 sounds small. In energy, it is nearly a factor of 3, and this caldera has climbed half a magnitude unit in 3 years. That climb is not an impression. It is a ladder you can draw, rung by rung, and it is the clearest way to see where this system has been heading. Follow the sequence. September 2023, magnitude 4.2, then the strongest earthquake of the modern unrest. May 2024, 4.4, instantly labeled the strongest in 40 years. March 2025, 4.4 again. June 30th, 2025, 4.6, a new record. And then a second 4.6 later the same year. May of this year, another 4.4. And yesterday evening, 4.7. 4 record-setting or record-tying earthquakes in under 3 years, each one striking the same few square kilometers of caldera floor, each one landing on buildings already cracked by the one before. Yesterday's record is not an isolated event. It is the newest and highest rung on a ladder this volcano has been climbing steadily since 2023. The historical comparison sharpens it further. The last great Bradycism crisis, from 1982 to 1984, lifted the ground about 1.8 meters and terrified the region. The Italian state ultimately moved roughly 40,000 people out of Pozzuoli's old center, and parts of the town stood semi-abandoned for years. That crisis, for all its fear, topped out around magnitude 4. The current unrest has now exceeded the worst seismic moment of the 1980s by half a magnitude unit. On crust, the published research says is only about a third as strong as it was then. And unlike the 80s crisis, which rose and subsided inside 3 years, this one has been building for more than 20, slower, longer, and with a higher ceiling every time it tests itself. There is one genuinely reassuring fact in that history, and it deserves equal airtime. The 1982 crisis ended without eruption. The system pressurized, cracked, terrified everyone, and then resealed. 2 years of fear resolved into decades of quiet. That precedent is the strongest argument that record earthquakes by themselves do not mean magma is coming. But the 80s crisis is also the reason today's scientists watch this system so closely, because it proved the caldera can walk right up to the edge of everyone's nerves and hold there. The question that actually decides what happens next is not the magnitude at all. It is whether anything else in the monitoring data has started to move. And that brings us to the most contentious part of this story: the alert level. Campi Flegrei has sat at yellow, level 2 on a 4-step scale, since 2012. It was yellow when the 4.2 struck in 2023, yellow through the 4.4 of 2024, yellow through both 4.6s of 2025, and as of last night, after the strongest earthquake ever recorded at the caldera, it is still yellow. No change was announced, and the official position is that yesterday's event, record or not, remains consistent with the ongoing volcano-tectonic unrest. Pressurized fluids cracking old rock, not magma on the move. To be fair to the officials, that position is grounded in real science. The alert framework is built on multiple parameters, not magnitude: the depth distribution of earthquakes, the uplift rate, and the chemistry of the gas pouring out of the Solfatara and Pozzuoli fumaroles. The signals that would genuinely indicate escalation are specific. Earthquakes migrating downward as if tracking rising magma, harmonic tremor, uplift accelerating well past the roughly 10 millimeters per month it has held, or a step change in the magmatic fraction of the fumarole gases. As of last night, none of those thresholds had been reported crossed. On the framework's own terms, yellow is defensible, but a growing group of Italian scientists argues the framework itself is the problem, and they have gotten louder with every record. Their case runs like this: the alert system is calibrated to detect magmatic escalation, but the two hazards most likely to hurt people in the near term have no formal trigger anywhere in it. The first is exactly what happened last night: repeated shallow shaking progressively demolishing a fragile building stock, 4 injuries at a time. The second is a phreatic explosion, a steam-driven blast from the overpressured hydrothermal system that requires no magma at the surface, can occur essentially without useful warning, and would be lethal within its radius in an area as densely inhabited as this. Several prominent researchers have said publicly, speaking as individuals rather than for their institutions, that they would already be moving the most exposed residents of the Pozzuoli core, because a warning system tuned to magma may stay calmly yellow right up until the moment one of those non-magmatic hazards arrives. That tension has also fed a viral claim worth dispatching quickly: that authorities know an eruption is imminent and are hiding it. The data do not support that. The INGV publishes its monitoring bulletins every single week for anyone to read. The deformation and gas numbers are public, and none of them shifted into a pre-eruptive configuration yesterday. The honest concern is not a cover-up. It is a gap between what the alert level measures and what the residents of Pozzuoli are physically living through. And a record earthquake with the alert unchanged is the sharpest illustration of that gap yet. The next days and weeks have a clear watch list, and it starts underfoot. Watch the aftershock sequence. If the swarm around yesterday's event decays over the coming days, this record will settle into the same uneasy pattern as the last 4. If instead the caldera produces another event in the mid-4 range or higher within a short window, that would mark a further acceleration of the latter, and pressure on the authorities to reconsider the alert level would become severe. Watch the depths too. The earthquake staying shallow within the top 3 kilometers is the hydrothermal pattern. Hypocenters stepping downward would be a different and far more serious signal. Beyond the seismology, 3 numbers will tell the story. The uplift rate, currently about 10 millimeters per month, is the master variable. Sustained acceleration would change every calculation because every study of this system agrees the pressure driving the uplift and the earthquakes are one and the same. The fumarole chemistry at Solfatara and Pozzuoli, published in the INGV's weekly bulletins, is the volcano's blood test. A rising magmatic fraction in those gases is among the earliest reliable warnings this system can give, and the building inspections now underway across Pozzuoli and western Naples will determine how many structures enter the next earthquake already compromised, because on the current trend there will be a next one. The record set last night will stand until the volcano breaks it, and nothing in 20 years of data suggests it has stopped trying. The strongest earthquake in Campi Flegrei's instrumental history is now also the clearest measurement yet of a system still loading, and the honest summary is the one the scientists themselves keep repeating. This ends with the shaking getting worse before it gets better. We will be tracking the aftershocks, the uplift, and the alert level debate as they develop, and when this caldera moves again, you will hear about it here.